For nearly 3 decades, American workers and manufacturers have relied on Canada as one of their most stable customers. From auto parts to industrial steel, hundreds of United States factories supplied Canadian industries and consumers with consistent orders, forming a backbone of cross-border trade. But in early 2025, that foundation began to crack. In just 2 months, more than 300 United States factories spanning the Midwest and East Coast lost their Canadian supply contracts. Orders that had long been routine suddenly evaporated, not because American production capacity had failed, but because Canada restructured its supply chain. Ottawa's new trade strategy favors imports from Europe, Asia, and South America while strengthening domestic production. For United States businesses, the fallout has been immediate lost revenue, falling employment, and growing anxiety in communities that depend on industrial jobs. The Canadian government framed its decision as a move toward long-term stability and competitiveness. Several factors drove this change. Reducing dependence on the United States has become, a real priority for Canada. After years of dealing with tariffs and policy shifts from Washington, Ottawa started to see its over-reliance on the U.S. as a vulnerability. To address this, Canada has signed new trade agreements with the European Union, Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, South America. This move ensures access to more suppliers and, honestly, more competitive pricing. Ottawa is also encouraging local factories to expand their production by offering subsidies and prioritizing government contracts for Canadian firms. Addressing cost competitiveness, it's a real challenge. American labor, insurance, and energy costs remain higher than in many other countries. Goods from Asia and Europe often arrive 15 to 20% cheaper, making them attractive alternatives. Political risk is another big factor. Changes in U.S. administrations frequently reshape trade policies. For Canadian businesses planning supply chains years in advance, this instability raised red flags. As a result, Ottawa's restructuring has placed American factories outside Canada's new priority list. The immediate impact was pretty dramatic. Contracts canceled overnight. Within weeks of the policy shift, American businesses saw decades-old supply contracts canceled. Many factories had little time to adapt or seek new customers. So, when it comes to auto parts and machinery, Ontario's auto industry, which had always relied on U.S. parts, started shifting orders to Japan, South Korea, and Germany. In just about 2 months, more than 70 U.S. parts factories reported revenue losses ranging from 30 to 50%. Smaller firms, unfortunately, were forced into furloughs and shortened work weeks. Moving on to steel and metals, states like Pennsylvania and Illinois used to supply sheet steel and aluminum to Canadian manufacturers. But now, these contracts are being redirected to suppliers in the EU and South America, mostly because their prices are lower. U.S. steel prices dropped by 15% due to excess inventory, which forced Rust Belt mills to cut shifts. And for wood and furniture, American timber and furniture exports are being replaced by products from Scandinavia and Southeast Asia. Wood plants in Oregon and North Carolina had to cut capacity by 20 to 40%, and workers there faced pay cuts or layoffs. Tractors, harvesters, and processing machinery that once shipped north from United States suppliers are now being imported from Germany, Italy, and Japan. American manufacturers reported revenue declines of between 25 and 35%. Canned goods, beverages, and processed items that once filled Canadian supermarket shelves are now subject to new certification requirements. United States companies face costs 15 to 20% higher just to meet these rules, while Canadian chains are pivoting to imports from Europe and Australia. Behind the trade numbers, there's a chain reaction affecting entire towns. Factories reduce output by 30 to 60% when contracts vanish. Workers face layoffs or furloughs, losing the primary income that supported their families. Local businesses suffer as consumer spending falls. Restaurants, shops, and service providers all feel the cutback. Raw material suppliers from farmers to component makers lose their customers in processing plants. Transport and logistics companies see idle trucks and fewer shipments, forcing drivers into reduced hours or unemployment. Municipal budgets shrink as tax revenues from factories and workers decline. Communities depopulate, with residents leaving in search of jobs elsewhere. In just 2 months, over 100 United States industrial towns began reporting signs of localized recessions. For many communities, Canadian trade had been their economic lifeline, now suddenly severed. So, let's talk about the risk of permanent market loss. When a country loses its foothold in a market, especially one as significant as Canada, getting back in can be, well, really tough. Once those business relationships are broken, the opportunity might not return. There are a few reasons why recovery will be difficult. First off, Canadian companies have already signed contracts with European Union and Asian suppliers, and breaking those agreements would be, pretty costly. Next, foreign suppliers often offer lower prices, or they're just better at adapting to Canada's new certification requirements. Ottawa is also stepping up efforts to boost its own factories, aiming to replace American imports with homegrown products using subsidies and tax incentives. On top of that, Canada is part of trade agreements like CETA and CPTPP, which give their member countries tariff benefits that United States exporters simply don't have. And honestly, the loss of trust is a big deal. Cancelled or delayed United States shipments during the transition made Canadian buyers look for more reliable partners. Once those supply chains adapt, re-entering the market becomes both costly and complex. So for United States exporters, the Canadian door may not reopen anytime soon. Now let's take a look at possible scenarios for United States industry moving forward. The forecast isn't set in stone, but yeah, it's clear that the path ahead comes with some real challenges. Negotiation and trade diplomacy are now front and center. The United States Department of Commerce and the U.S. Trade Representative are opening talks with Ottawa to ease technical barriers. Legal challenges under the USMCA are also being considered if measures are deemed excessively protectionist. Washington is, reviewing emergency aid packages. This includes tax breaks for exporters, job retention subsidies, and low-interest loans to help factories survive the downturn. States most affected, like Michigan, Ohio, and Illinois, are sending trade missions directly to Ottawa. At the same time, they're also subsidizing transportation and taxes for factories to help them weather the storm. Market diversification is, becoming increasingly important. U.S. businesses are exploring South America, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East as new destinations. This kind of expansion requires redesigning products to meet different standards, and, forming alliances to share logistics costs. So, looking ahead, the long-term strategy will need to focus on reducing over-reliance on Canada by expanding into emerging Asian markets. It's also important to leverage U.S. influence in trade negotiations to secure more favorable terms. And, shifting toward high-value exports like high-tech machinery and advanced materials can help, since these are a bit less vulnerable to price competition. What started out as a sudden cancellation of contracts has now, honestly, evolved into a structural crisis for U.S. industry. More than 300 factories have already felt the shock, and thousands of workers are dealing with layoffs, wage cuts, and a lot of uncertainty. Canada's supply chain restructuring really signals a new phase in North American trade, one where partnership just can't be taken for granted anymore. Ottawa has shown it can pivot quickly to alternative suppliers whenever political or economic risks start to grow. For the U.S., the lesson here is, pretty sobering. Over-reliance on a single export market carries some real dangers. To protect workers, factories, and entire communities, American industry is going to need to adapt quickly through diplomacy, diversification, and innovation. The future of cross-border trade might stabilize, but the events of 2025 will definitely be remembered as a wake-up call. When trade partners